2 decades ago, naturalist and environmental writer Brooke Williams had a dream about a dragonfly, and that sort of cracked open his world. And it gave rise to a steady stream of dragonfly encounters in his waking life, almost as if they had something to tell him. Today, I've invited Brooke, who has spent the last 40 years advocating for wilderness and writing about his own adventures exploring both the inner and outer wilds, to come to our show. Because as I've had conversations with all of you throughout the last couple of months, as we've tackled your questions, I've also started to realize that I want to help us build a toolkit with all kinds of different tools that we can use to consider questions as we move forward. This week, Brooke introduces us to a tool that is part psychology, part wonder, and part magic, the practice of re-enchantment. I'm excited to add this to our toolkit and see what it has to offer us and what possibilities it opens. I'm Mauricio Bruce, and this is The Real Question. Hi, Brooke. Welcome to the show. I'm really excited to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. I love talking about this stuff.
I do too. I really enjoyed reading your book. I was really happy to see that there was a book on re-enchantment out. Can we start by you telling us a little bit about how this all started for you? The dream, the first sense of your life becoming enchanted?
Yeah, so 2 decades ago, I was at a conference on an island in Canada, and it was a busy time. There were 3 or 4 days, and we stayed up late at night and got up early in the morning. And one morning, we had an assignment to read a paper over lunch, and then we'd talk about it after lunch. So I went to read the paper. I sat down on the edge of this island, my back against a big boulder, and I started reading the paper, which must have been quite boring because I fell immediately to sleep. And the nap I had included a dream in which a dragonfly appeared. After that dream, within minutes, actually, I got up thinking I was late for the next session. I started up the trail and I started seeing dragonflies everywhere. And I couldn't believe that I was seeing these dragonflies so soon after this dream, especially because as a field naturalist and someone who's always cared about learning from the natural world, I had paid attention to things, and I only had 2 memories of ever seeing a dragonfly. I know I'd seen more than that, but only 2 memories that were specific. And since then, I've had hundreds. So my question going into this book was, A, why are these little creatures so incredible? But B, why did they make their way into this dream? And what happened? What kind of barrier had there been between my unconscious and my conscious lives that was somehow pierced by that dream? And what I've learned since is that it's not like something really shifted except for my own point of view. A few years later, I was at a meeting at Harvard where we were listening to a book review by a guy named Joseph Storm, who had written a book called The Myth of Disenchantment. And during that review, I started to realize that disenchantment was something that came with modernity, that prior to that, our lives were enchanted. So if you look at evolutionary time, for most of our history, we've lived enchanted lives, and only recently have they been disenchanted. So I felt like that's what happened to me during that dream, is that my life had been disenchanted and was now re-enchanted.
Just where you've brought us there, can we define what enchantment means?
Simply put, I think enchantment is where we see everything in the world, everything around us as a subject, something with which we interact and learn from, as opposed to a disenchanted world where other is an object, something that we use and manipulate.
Mm-hmm. So if I'm understanding correctly, re-enchantment is changing my point of view to see everything in the world as alive, everything in the world as being a subject, as being a part of the world, rather than a piece of the world for me to use or to gain from.
Exactly.
You had this dream that sort of, you said, helped you change your point of view. And you started seeing dragonflies everywhere. I'm really curious about that dream. I've had interesting and sort of important dreams myself. And I'm wondering, have dreams become another portal for you since? I mean, I know dragonflies come. You've continued to pay attention to dreams.
Oh, I really do. Unfortunately, I don't have many dreams that are just those mind-blowing kinds of dreams, really numinous dreams, maybe 2 or 3 a year that I really have to get up and write them down and think about for days. But I read a lot about Jung, and I've read a lot of books about his theories and teachings, and Robert Johnson's become an author whose books line my shelves. One of them is called Inner Work, Dreams and Active Imagination. So the two subjects there, dreams and active imagination, are covered in the same book. Jung loved it when one of his patients came to him with a dream, because the symbols in that dream helped Jung access that person's unconscious, where a lot of the issues that they really tried to get to were kept. And so I've learned from that book about active imagination. I have a practice, and there's a couple of examples of it in the book, where if I have a question, I can kind of go into this space and my imagination sort of takes over, and I realize that I'm not really making things up, but I'm finding things that are in there that need to be on the surface instead of deep in my unconscious. And so I'm able to have those experiences whenever I'm ready or I feel like I need one. And I use the symbols in the same way that I would if I had actually dreamed them while asleep.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. I have an active imagination practice myself. One of the things that I like most about it is allowing myself to be surprised by what comes up, right? It's not a planned thing where your mind or your brain is creating what you're imagining. It sort of pops up and you're able to surprise yourself. We've talked about re-enchantment and now we're talking about active imagination. And you talked about it from Jung. And I wonder, I'm sure you do, but you know the story where Jung was working with a patient who had had a dream about a beetle. And then there was a little scratching noise behind him, and he looked, and there was a beetle at the window. And he opened it and let the beetle come in. And there was a synchronicity there. That's where he came up with the idea of synchronicity. But it was also, if we think about it right now, an enchanted world that was crossing those boundaries of the real or the ordinary and the non-ordinary. As she was having the dream, the non-ordinary was almost reaching through.
Yep. Well, and I refer to that story because I think it's so similar. And what you've just described, I think, is the point of view shift that I'm talking about when it comes to, is the world enchanted or not? Because Jung was sitting there with a patient talking about the dream she had in which that scarab appeared to her. I think it was jewelry, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was.
He hears the tapping at the window. He opens the window, grabs the beetle, and says, "Here's your beetle." And he, obviously, by saying that, was living in an enchanted world. And I felt he really did at all times. She, on the other hand, had a choice. She could say, "No, that's just a coincidence. There's no way on earth that's connected to what we were just talking about." Or she could have had a different point of view, which is, "Oh my God, that's just what we were talking about." And I think that's the way she took it, because it apparently was a big, important session for her in terms of how she was able to respond to the therapy that she was getting.
I'm wondering, because that moment, you're saying it was a choice, and I like that idea. Do you think re-enchantment is something that we choose, that we have to remember, that we have to learn? How do you see it?
Well, I think we have to relearn it. I think there's so many things in our modern lives that conspire against it that we have to pay very close attention. I think there's so many things competing for our attention these days. And I think if I had to say one word to describe all of this conversation, my book, all of it, it is about attention. And how do we manage our attention in these times? And we have these phones that they make these sounds that are grabbing our attention all the time. And there are ways that these gigantic companies are monetizing our attention. And we don't even get like a cut of the money they're making on our attention. And I feel like attention is like either active or passive. Passive attention is to sit there and wait for something that comes along that's competing for our attention and wants to grab it. Where I love this idea, I think it's Ortega y Gasset, who wrote a lot about primitive hunting. And he once said that the hunter only knows one thing, that he does not know what will happen next. And I love that idea of living your life so that you do not know every moment, you do not know what will happen next, but you want to find it. You want to find that thing that, as Arnold Mindell said, wants to flirt with you. There's something out there. I mean, we've been on hundreds of different walks in nature with many different kinds of people. And you can talk about what happened on that walk when you're through. And these 5 people who walk down the same path, one after another, will always come back with a completely different thing that they saw. Something different flirted with them. And I love that idea because what flirts with you is something that you need right then. And I feel like that's the challenge of our lives, is to find those things that are flirting with us rather than those things that are trying to buy and sell our attention. Does that make sense?
Yes, of course it makes sense. It's beautiful. And I think when you were talking about the choice that Jung's patient was making, do I believe that this has to do with my dream, or do I just say it's a coincidence? In a way, that choice, if I heard you right, what it affords or what it allows her is to live in a world that is flirting with her and that is speaking directly to her, rather than a world that is just sort of random and
it's a neutral existence. Yeah, it's a neutral existence.
Neutral world. Yeah, yeah. The book is called Encountering Dragonfly: Notes on the Practice of Re-Enchantment. And I'm wondering, what makes it a practice for you rather than just a state?
What makes it a practice is I think you have to consciously make a decision that this is the way you want to live and shift your point of view. To me, it's like fascinating to go through life thinking that there is no such thing as a coincidence, that everything is a synchronicity. Because when you start to think about it's possible that everything I notice has some kind of meaning for me, then it becomes like a practice of just paying attention to what happens around you. And to wonder about it and to think about it. And I mean, it's changed the way I do everything, really. I feel like before I would just kind of, walk through life with my brain, even if I was running or on a bike or walking downtown, my brain was always 2 steps ahead of me, wondering, what I needed to do, where I was going. Did I put money in the parking meter? As opposed to, oh my God, what could happen? And I've made a practice of like standing in line at the grocery store, instead of looking at my phone, just sort of looking around and seeing what's going on around me. Like even the person in front of me, like what's the story? What story does that person have? I just feel like it adds multiple dimensions to life.
I'm just going to sort of hook onto that because you're talking about the story of the person in front of you at the line and the stories that are around us. What role do you think stories or storytellers play in re-enchantment or the re-enchantment of our life?
Oh, the storytellers are what should I say? The shamans, the teachers, the leaders, because I think stories are really all we have. Years ago, I went to a reading. Sherman Alexie, he's a native writer. Maybe you've heard of him.
I have.
He was reading from his book called The Lone Ranger and Tonto Fistfight in Heaven. I was following along. I already had my copy of the book, and I was following along, and there was different. He didn't read from it. He just told the stories from the book, as opposed to getting up and reading them. And when it was time for questions, I raised my hand, and he called on me, and I said, I've got your book here, and the story that you told was different than the story in the book. And he said, so? The story that I wrote was the story I needed that day, and the story that I just told was the story I needed today. Next question. And I think about that all the time.
It sounds like re-enchantment or enchantment allows us to stay present with the world and present with ourselves and making meaning and connected to everything that's happening around us. And when I connect it to active imagination, in a way, correct me if I'm wrong, but re-enchantment is a way to have active imagination in the ordinary world rather than just sort of in the world of dreams and in the non-ordinary, unconscious world.
That's fascinating. I hadn't thought of it, but I think you're right. The stories are all around us all the time, in the present, in ordinary reality. And I think for us to even consider what those stories are requires an imaginative approach, don't you?
I do. Absolutely.
So I think that's really true. That our imagination should be active, whether it's in ordinary or non-ordinary reality. And maybe there's really no difference between the two, is the point.
And I think, Brooke, that imagination has been for so long relegated sort of as a kid's game or something for children. But what I'm hearing is it's not. It's a practice that we can constantly use to stay present with ourselves, with our world, and with our role in it.
Yeah, exactly.
I want to bring it back to our listeners, and I'm wondering, we have a show where people come in and ask questions. A lot of people are stuck asking about a decision that's going to impact their future in one way or another. And I'm wondering, with this conversation that we've had, how can enchantment help our listeners, you think?
I just feel like if somebody can do, two things mainly, I think can help. One is to consider that there is no such thing as a coincidence, that everything is a synchronicity, and to try to understand what that really means, to pay close attention to those things that flirt with us. That's one. The other is to completely get away from objectification. I feel like so much of our problem these days is one group of people objectifying almost everything else on the planet, every other person, every other thing, every other whatever. And if you start to think about not just how I can make use of this, but what is it trying to teach me? What can I learn from it or this person? I think those things can change our lives like overnight. I mean, it's interesting. I teach this sometimes at Colby College in Maine, and we practice a lot of these things that you and I have talked about now, but also others. And, I always get from the back row, the football players rolling their eyes back and kind of wondering, is this really the class I need to be in? And I say to them, I don't know if any of this is true, but I do know one thing, that if you live this way, your life will be much more interesting. And by the end of the semester, they all believe that that's true. And how many of them continue that way, I don't know. But I watch this evolution happen with people, and it's like we get a choice. I mean, if we choose to not believe anything that cannot be proven, think how limited that is. And think how expansive it is to be able to choose.
I'm wondering, Brooke, are there any practices that you recommend to our listeners? Anything that they could practice to try to start exploring this world?
What comes to mind is the practice that I use, which is I sit down at my computer, not every day, but almost every day, and I start to type, and I type 1,000 words before I stop. And I don't think about what I'm going to write. I just think about making sure I keep my fingers moving. And it doesn't matter what comes of it. It's an end in itself. I mean, maybe out of 10 days, I'll find 3 or 4 sentences later that I just kind of look at and go, my God, I'm glad I was there for that one. But most of it is like drivel. But I feel like the practice itself of just getting those words out of me and onto the page, and then later on kind of searching through them for any nuggets, I think is really been important to me. It's a meditation, but it's also it helps me make sense of my world for sure. I think in this day and age, any sense that we can make of the world is like golden.
I'm going to recommend that practice to our listeners, 1,000 words a day. And if any of you want to share what nuggets you get out of those 1,000 words, we would love to hear it. Brooke, It has been like a real pleasure talking to you. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and I am so grateful and so honored that you've come on our show.
Well, I'm so honored that I was asked. I hope that we've left your listeners with something that is useful, and I hope that we get a chance to do it again.
Encountering Dragonfly: Notes on the Practice of Re-Enchantment by Brooke Williams. It's a really interesting, it's a beautiful book full of little stories that slowly guide us to understand the power of re-enchantment. Brooke, where can they find you if they want to follow you, if they want to learn more about you, if they want to connect with you? Is there a website? Is there an Instagram?
Well, yeah, I have both Instagram and Facebook. And I also have a website, brookewilliams.site. It hasn't been upgraded for a little while, but it's got some information on it, and I'm working on it. It's one of those things that I'm not very good at, but I have some people helping. But yeah, I can be found.
Amazing. Well, I look forward to talking with you again, and maybe you can show up in my active imagination.
Yeah, let me know if I do, because that would be good for me to think about too.
All right. Thank you, Brooke. I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you so much.
This has been The Real Question. Our show is funded through our Patreon at patreon.com/realquestionpod. I'm going to keep inviting you to come down to Patreon and look at everything we have to offer. If you haven't been there, just come take a peek. There's no commitment. I promise you'll be enchanted. Another way you can support this show is by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening. You can also follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Real Question Pod. We are always looking for more guests. Go to our website, realquestionpod.com, and submit your question, and we can talk about it right here on the show. We love to shout out our BFF tier patrons, Renee Underhill, Amanda Schramm, Christina Igu Brandon, and Jackson Paul Keeley. Thank you. We are a Not Sorry production. Our executive producer is Vanessa Zoltan. We are edited and produced by Ariana Nettleman. Music is by Nick Bowl. And we're distributed by Acast. Support for this show comes from the Fetzer Institute. Thank you, Brooke, for joining us today. Thank you for opening the doors of re-enchantment for me and for our listeners, and welcoming us into a world that is alive and full of meaning. Thanks as always to our wonderful team, Julia Argy, Nikki Zoltan, AJ Yaramas, Anissa Ahmed, Danny Langley, Courtney Brown, Casper Turkile, and Stephanie Paulsell. Join us next week for another question and another episode. See you then.